Naples does not whisper. It roars through cracked cobblestone alleys that smell of espresso and salt air, through the throats of fishermen hauling nets at 4 in the morning, through the bells of churches that have witnessed more sin than any confession booth could ever contain. Naples speaks with its chest, and every person born inside its borders learns early that silence is not peace. Silence in Naples is a warning, and no name commanded more silence than Calabrese. Don Enzo Calabrese had not always been a legend. He had once been a boy who chased pigeons through the Quartieri Spagnoli and stole figs from old Signora Ferrante's garden. He had once been a teenager who fell in love with a girl named Giovanna at a Sunday market, who had laughed so loudly at something he said that she knocked over an entire display of ceramic saints and paid for every single one without flinching. And he had once been a young man who built something from nothing, who chose a particular road because it was the only road available to a man with his name, his blood, and his lack of options in a city that devoured the weak before breakfast. But that was before power settled over him like a second skin, before the Calabrese name became a sentence people spoke carefully, the way you handle broken glass, gently, at the edges, never in the middle. By the time the story truly begins, Don Enzo Calabrese was 48 years old, a widower of 6 years, and the undisputed authority over the most formidable crime family in southern Italy. He controlled the port of Naples with the quiet efficiency of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to make a point. Politicians returned his calls within minutes. Police captains adjusted their patrol routes based on his preferences. Rival families from Palermo to Calabria sent emissaries with careful words and careful gifts, because no one wanted to be the organization that miscalculated Enzo Calabrese. And yet, and this is the detail that made the entire region lean in and whisper, every single day, Don Enzo Calabrese visited a grave 3 times. Morning, noon, and evening, without exception, without variation, without apology. His late wife Giovanna was buried in a small private cemetery on the eastern edge of his estate, a hillside plot with a view of the bay that she had once pointed to from their bedroom window and said, "When I am old and done with this world, I want to rest somewhere I can still hear the water." She had not been old when she died. She had been 42, taken by an illness that moved faster than anything Enzo's money or fury could combat. He had sat beside her for 11 days and nights without leaving the room, and when she was finally gone, something in him had calcified, hardened into a shape that looked like composure, but was really just grief wearing a well-tailored suit. The grave visits were the one thing about Don Enzo Calabrese that nobody mocked, not even behind his back, not even the men who feared him and resented him in equal measure. Because there was something in those 3 daily pilgrimages, flowers in the morning, a glass of her favorite wine left at noon, a quiet conversation in the evening, that reminded even the most hardened men around him that somewhere beneath all that power was a human being who had simply loved someone and lost her, and hadn't figured out what to do with that loss except to carry it faithfully. His son Marco carried nothing faithfully. Marco Calabrese was 28, spectacularly handsome, and blessed with the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having faced a consequence he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. He was not cruel by nature, but he was careless. The way certain beautiful things are careless, like a fire that doesn't consider what it consumes. He loved his father in the complicated way that sons love powerful men they simultaneously admire and struggle to exist beside. He drank too much, laughed too loudly, and had a talent for placing himself directly in the center of situations that required adult supervision. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Marco walked into a bar in the Chiaia district, made a comment to the wrong man about the wrong woman, and walked out 40 minutes later with a knife wound in his side that was deep enough to require immediate medical attention, but not so deep that it interrupted his ability to be annoying about the entire situation. His bodyguard, Nico, a man of infinite patience and very little conversation, drove him not to a hospital, because hospitals meant questions, and questions meant paperwork, and paperwork meant exposure, but to the private clinic on Via Petrarca. The clinic that served, without advertisement or signage, as the discreet medical refuge for anyone in Naples who needed stitches without explanations. It was 11:30 at night. The clinic was quiet, and the nurse on duty was Lucia Mancini. Lucia was 26 years old and had spent the last 4 years systematically building a life that had nothing to do with the world she'd grown up in. She was the daughter of Don Enzo Mancini, a mid-tier street boss who operated in the northeastern neighborhoods of Naples and who had spent most of Lucia's childhood either absent or arriving home with the particular exhausted tension of a man whose work could not be discussed at dinner. Her mother Rosa had died when Lucia was 16, and that loss had split her life cleanly into 2 periods. Before, when she still hoped the world might be simple, and after, when she accepted that it would not be and decided to be useful inside its complexity rather than crushed by it. She became a nurse because she believed in fixing what could be fixed. She worked at the clinic on Via Petrarca because the money was good and the questions were few, and she was skilled enough that the work was genuinely interesting rather than merely functional. She had heard the name Calabrese, of course. Every person in Naples had heard the name Calabrese, but names were just names until they had faces, and she had never had occasion to put a face to that particular name, or until Marco bled onto her examination table and immediately told her she was being too rough. Lucia looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been awake since 6 in the morning and has no remaining reserves of tolerance for nonsense. She told him that if he would prefer to be treated gently, he was welcome to wait for a gentler nurse, and that the nearest one she was aware of was in Milan. She returned to cleaning the wound with the same efficient and practiced hands she brought to everything. Marco blinked. Then he laughed, genuinely, surprised by her, amused in the way people are when they encounter something they weren't expecting. He told her his name. She told him she had already read it off the intake form and that it hadn't changed her technique. He told her most people reacted differently to his name. She told him that reactions didn't close wounds. She stitched him up with precision. We gave him post-care instructions in the no-nonsense tone of someone who expects them to be followed, and told Nico to make sure he rested for 72 hours. Marco left grinning despite himself. He told his father about her in the morning. He meant to be casual about it, just a story, a funny anecdote about a nurse who hadn't been impressed. But Enzo listened with the attentiveness he gave to everything, and something in the telling, the detail that she hadn't flinched, hadn't deferred, he hadn't changed the temperature of her voice when Marco said his name, settled in him like a small stone dropping into still water. He sent Franco to the clinic with a formal envelope of thanks and an offer to compensate the clinic for its services. Lucia sent the envelope back unopened with a note. Services were rendered at standard rates and have been paid. No further compensation required. Enzo read the note twice. Then he put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. The following morning, after his first visit to Giovanna's grave, he drove to the clinic himself. He did not announce himself. He arrived at 8:15, when the clinic was quiet and the morning light was still pale and watery through the front windows. He sat in the waiting area for 11 minutes before Lucia appeared from the back corridor with a chart in her hand. Wearing scrubs and a measured expression that shifted only slightly, a nearly imperceptible tightening around the eyes, when she registered who was sitting in her waiting room. She did not rush. She finished writing what she was writing on the chart, capped her pen, and approached him at a pace that communicated clearly that his presence did not alter her schedule. He stood when she reached him, which surprised her. Men of his standing did not typically stand for people of her standing. He introduced himself, Enzo Calabrese, as though she might not know, and thanked her for treating his son. He thanked her specifically, he said, because Marco had told him she had been direct with him, and Enzo had found over the years that directness was the rarest and most valuable quality in any human being. Lucia studied him for a moment. He was not what the stories had built. The stories had built a monument, broad, dark, impenetrable. The man in front of her was all of those things in his posture and his bearing, but his eyes were different. There was something tired in them. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, but the tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had simply grown so accustomed to the weight that he no longer mentioned it. She thanked him for coming in person, which was more than most people bothered to do. She told him Marco's wound would heal cleanly if he followed the instructions. She told him that if Marco found himself unable to follow instructions, which she suspected was a recurring theme in his life, he was welcome to return, and she would repeat them more slowly. The corner of Enzo's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. He left. She stood in the doorway of the clinic and watched the car pull away. And then she went back to work and told herself very firmly that she had no opinion about Don Enzo Calabrese beyond the clinically relevant one that he had good posture for a man his age. 3 days later, her world came apart. Her father called her to his house, a thing he did rarely, and only when something was wrong in a way he couldn't discuss over the phone. She found him sitting at the kitchen table looking like a man who had not slept in 4 days, which, she would learn, was accurate. The kitchen smelled like old coffee and anxiety. He was smaller than she remembered, which happened sometimes when you saw your parents in moments of genuine fear. The architecture of the person you'd spent your life looking up to suddenly revealing its frailties. Teo Mancini told his daughter the truth, which was also rare, and which told her before he'd finished speaking that whatever he was about to say was very bad. 11 years ago, Rosa Mancini, Lucia's mother, had died under circumstances that were complicated. What the death certificate said and what had actually happened were two different things, and the distance between those two versions of events had been quietly managed, at great personal risk and expense, by Don Enzo Calabrese. Enzo had done it not out of generosity, but because Teo had come to him at the lowest moment of his life and offered everything he had. And Enzo had looked at a grieving man holding a secret that could destroy him, and had chosen, for reasons Teo had never fully understood, to absorb the risk rather than exploit it. That absorption had created a debt, a significant one. And Teo, who had been slowly drowning in financial obligations to a rival network, had done something irreversible. He had gone to Enzo with a proposal, not a financial arrangement, not a territorial concession, but something older and uglier. And he had proposed that the debt be settled through the binding of the two families. He had proposed, without asking her, that Lucia be the settlement. The silence in the kitchen lasted a very long time. Lucia set down her coffee cup with a care that was almost theatrical, the careful deliberateness of someone managing a rage so enormous that any small movement could shatter it. She looked at her father. She asked him, with a quietness that was somehow more frightening than shouting, and whether he had genuinely sat across from another man and used her name as currency. Teo did not make excuses. To his credit, in this moment at least, he did not pretend what he had done was anything other than what it was. He told her he was desperate. He told her he was sorry. He told her Enzo had not yet formally accepted or refused. Lucia stood up, picked up her car keys, and drove directly to the Calabrese estate. She did not think about what she was doing. She was past thinking. She was operating on something older than thought, a fury that lived in the chest and moved through the body like heat, and she was going to walk into the house of the most powerful man in Naples and tell him, to his face, that she was not a bargaining chip in anyone's game. She didn't know, driving through those dark streets with her hands tight on the wheel and her jaw set like stone, that this was the moment the story truly began. Not the clinic, not the note sent back unopened, not the morning visit or the tired eyes or the ghost of a smile. This. Lucia Mancini, driving toward Don Enzo Calabrese with every intention of telling him exactly who she was. The gates of the Calabrese estate stood 14 feet high and were made of wrought iron so old and so dense that they looked less like a security measure and more like a permanent statement, a declaration in metal that said, without ambiguity, that whatever was on the other side of this boundary was not part of the ordinary world. 2 guards stood at the entrance, and when Lucia's car stopped and she stepped out with the particular energy of someone who had not driven 40 minutes in the dark to be turned around at a gate, both men straightened involuntarily before they'd made a conscious decision to do so. She told them she was here to see Don Calabrese. They told her there was no appointment. She told them she was Lucia Mancini, one daughter of Teo Mancini, and that the Don would want to hear what she had to say. There was a radio call, a pause, and then the gates opened. Franco met her at the front door, a compact, silver-haired man with eyes that had seen everything and were surprised by nothing, though Lucia noticed the slight elevation of his brow when he registered her alone at night, walking toward the house of Don Enzo Calabrese with that particular stride. He led her through a foyer that smelled of old wood and beeswax and something faintly floral, jasmine perhaps, or something close to it. The house was not what she'd expected. It was full of books, real ones, with cracked spines and margins that looked read into. There were photographs on the walls, not portraits of power but genuine family images, candid and warm, the kind that accumulate in homes where people actually live rather than merely reside. She noted all of this and held her composure together with both hands as Franco led her to the study and knocked, and Enzo's voice came from inside, steady and low, telling him to send her in. He was standing when she entered, which again surprised her, though she refused to let it show. The study was lit warmly, a desk lamp and a fireplace, and walls of books that reached the ceiling, and a man who looked at her with an expression that was unreadable but not unkind. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She did not sit. She spoke first. She had prepared words on the drive over, organized arguments, structured points, but what came out was cleaner and more honest than anything she'd rehearsed. She told him that she knew about her father's proposal. She told him that it had been made without her knowledge or consent, and that she wanted him to understand, directly and without ambiguity, that she was not an object to be exchanged. She was a licensed medical professional with a life she had built with her own intelligence and her own hands, and she was not available as a resolution to anyone else's financial incompetence, regardless of who was collecting the debt. She told him that she respected that her father owed him something real. She told him that debt was legitimate, and that she was not here to dismiss it, but she was here to make clear that she was a person, and not a payment. And if he was the kind of man who collected on obligations using women who had no voice in the transaction, then he was not the man she'd briefly considered he might be. And then she stopped, and she held his gaze, and she waited. The fire made a sound in the silence. Enzo looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I never asked for you." He said it plainly, without drama. He told her that what Teo had proposed had not been his idea, that he had made no such request, and that no woman had ever been collected as a debt settlement in any arrangement he had overseen. He told her that Teo was a desperate man making desperate decisions, and that the proposal had been received by him with less enthusiasm than her father had apparently assumed. He told her the debt was real, yes, and it was significant, and he had not yet determined how it would be resolved, but this arrangement had not been his design. Then he said something she hadn't expected, and he said, "But the debt cannot simply disappear. Your father understood the terms when he came to me 11 years ago. I absorbed a risk to protect your family. That protection had a cost. The cost has not changed." He was not threatening her. He was being precise in the way that men are when they have thought carefully about their words and chosen each one deliberately. He was telling her that the situation was complicated, and that her fury, which he clearly found neither inappropriate nor surprising, did not alter the arithmetic of obligation. Lucia sat down, not because she'd been defeated, but because she was thinking. She thought for a long moment. Then she made a counter-proposal. She would not be anyone's bride by arrangement, but she was willing, temporarily and on her own terms, to take a position in his household as a private medical attendant for his elderly mother, Donna Carmela, who she had heard was in declining health, and who, by all accounts, was not receiving adequate, consistent care. She would be present. She would be professional. She would be treated as an employee, with the attendant dignity and compensation that implied, and the duration of her presence would count toward the gradual settlement of the obligation her father had created. She was not, she told him, doing this for her father's sake. She was doing it because she recognized that the alternative was watching her father face consequences she couldn't protect him from, and that was a reality she couldn't choose. Enzo studied her for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds. Then he said he found the proposal acceptable. He told Franco, who had been standing silent near the door, to arrange the formal terms in the morning. Lucia drove home in a state that was neither victory nor defeat. It was something stranger, the particular unsettled feeling of having stepped through a door that you cannot now unenter. She moved into the guest quarters of the estate 6 days later. Living inside the Calabrese estate was an education in contradiction. The house that looked like a fortress from the outside was, on the inside, full of small domestic rituals and quiet human details that Lucia absorbed despite her best attempts at professional detachment. Donna Carmela was 81, on sharp as a blade and deeply amused by Lucia from the first moment. She looked at her with the appraising eyes of a woman who had spent 60 years watching people and had developed opinions about most of them within the first 5 minutes of acquaintance. She told Lucia on the second day that she had the same posture as Giovanna, which was the highest compliment Donna Carmela offered to anyone. The work was genuine, and Lucia gave it genuine attention, monitoring Donna Carmela's medications, now managing her blood pressure and her mobility exercises. Sitting with her in the evenings for the card games, the old woman refused to give up. Donna Carmela, in exchange, told her things. Stories about this family, about this house, about the weight that Enzo had been carrying since Giovanna's death. Not gossip. Donna Carmela was not a gossip, but truth, offered carefully, the way someone who loves a person shares information about them when they believe it might matter. Lucia began to see Enzo differently. Not immediately. The process was gradual, involuntary, and somewhat annoying to her, because she had arrived at this house with a clear and simple view of who he was, and that view kept being complicated by evidence. She watched him, one afternoon from the corridor, sit with 3 men from rival families in the courtyard and resolve a territorial dispute that had the potential to become violent. He didn't raise his voice once. He used history, memory, in the weight of shared experience and consequence, and the men left with their dignity intact and a resolution nobody had expected. She watched him stop on the staircase one morning when he heard Donna Carmela laughing in the next room and stand there for a moment with his eyes closed, like he was storing the sound somewhere safe. She saw him leave 3 times a day, every day, with flowers in the morning and wine at noon and nothing in the evening but himself. One sleepless night, near the end of her 3rd week at the estate, she rose before dawn and watched him from the upper terrace as he walked across the grounds in the dark, a single stem of white lily in his hand. She watched him reach the grave, watched the shape of him settle in front of the stone, watched his head bow. She didn't follow him that night, but something in her had shifted. Some calcified judgment had developed a crack, and through it, something warmer and more dangerous had begun to seep. Marco watched all of this and misread it spectacularly. Marco had been observing Lucia since she arrived with the interested attention of a young man who found her exceptional and had fully expected, with the confidence of someone who had rarely been refused anything, that she would eventually notice him. When she noticed his father instead, or rather, when he noticed the way his father's attention moved differently when Lucia was in the room, something dark and juvenile stirred in him. He told himself it was protectiveness. It was not protectiveness. He began, quietly, and with the specific cunning of someone intelligent enough to be dangerous, but not wise enough to consider consequences, to plant seeds. A comment here to one of the underbosses, a question posed carefully to Franco about Lucia's background, a suggestion, dressed in the clothing of concern, and that someone whose father was Teo Mancini, a man with debts and desperation, might have motivations that weren't entirely transparent. The seeds found soil, not with Franco, who had watched Marco grow up and recognized the particular shape of his jealousy, but with 2 of the captains who had never been entirely comfortable with the arrangement and who needed very little encouragement to view an outsider inside the estate as a liability. And then Capitano Ricci, the corrupt police captain who had been playing both sides of Naples's underworld for 15 years and who had long wanted leverage over the Calabrese family, materialized with something that looked like evidence. Photographs, documents, a timeline suggesting that Lucia had been meeting with a law enforcement contact outside the clinic. The kind of fabrication that was good enough to be believable if you wanted to believe it. The inner circle was shaken. Franco brought it to Enzo immediately. Enzo called Lucia to his study. He was different in that meeting. Not cold exactly, but closed. The interior warmth she had begun to recognize in him, the quiet gravity that had nothing threatening in it, had been replaced by something formal and opaque. He told her what had come to his attention. He told her he needed to understand the truth of it. His voice was careful, measured, and completely without the small, subtle warmth that she had, without fully admitting it to herself, come to look for when he spoke. Lucia looked at him and understood immediately what had happened, and also what it meant that she was sitting in this chair being asked these questions. She answered them. She answered every single one, calmly and completely, with the patient clarity of someone who is telling the truth and knows it and has nothing to hide, and is also, beneath all of that composure, deeply hurt in a way she had not given herself permission to anticipate. When she was finished, she sat for a moment in the silence. Then she looked at him directly and said, "If you believed them over me, then you never saw me at all." She stood. She gathered herself. She walked out. She did not pack her things immediately. She sat in her room for 2 hours, very still, and thought about why it hurt the way it hurt. And the answer arrived with the particular unwelcome clarity of truths that have been circling for a while before finally landing. She had stopped seeing Don Enzo Calabrese as a problem to be managed. She had started seeing him as a person she respected and was perhaps, in ways she hadn't examined closely, beginning to feel something more complicated about. And that meant that his doubt, his immediate closure, the way those eyes had gone formal and shuttered, had landed somewhere that professional dignity alone could not explain. She was in the garden the following morning, sitting with Donna Carmela, when Franco appeared. He looked at Lucia with an expression that was unusual on him, something close to apology, which on Franco's face was so rare it was nearly unrecognizable. He told her that the Don requested her to stay. She said nothing. She continued attending to Donna Carmela's morning routine. Then in his study, Enzo was conducting the most thorough and ruthless internal investigation he had run in a decade. It took him 36 hours to pull the full thread. Marco's comments, the captains who had amplified them, Ricci's fabricated documents, and the channels through which they'd arrived. He had the truth of it by the evening of the second day, and he sat with that truth for a long time. He called Marco in and had a conversation with him that lasted 2 hours, during which Marco sat with the uncomfortable weight of a son being seen clearly by his father, not with rage, but with something that was almost worse, which was deep, quiet disappointment mixed with the particular love that does not flinch from honesty. Enzo told Marco precisely what he had done, what it had cost, and what it revealed about the person Marco was choosing to be. He told him that the next time Marco chose to act from jealousy dressed as concern, and there would be consequences that his name would not protect him from. Marco left that room different from how he'd entered it. Not transformed. Transformation takes time and work. But cracked open, a little. Beginning. Enzo removed Ricci from every network he'd been embedded in, with a finality that Ricci would spend years processing. And then, he went to find Lucia. He found her at the clinic. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the waiting room had 2 patients, an elderly man with a wrapped hand and a young mother with a child who had the glassy eyes of someone running a fever. Enzo sat in the plastic chair nearest the door, which was entirely wrong for a man of his bearing, and he waited. He did not send anyone ahead. He did not call. He simply arrived and sat and waited, because he understood, in the way that he understood most things, quietly and without needing to be told, that arriving without warning and waiting without impatience was the only approach that had any chance of being heard. Lucia came through the back corridor 40 minutes later, walked halfway across the waiting room, and stopped when she saw him. They looked at each other across the small room. The elderly man with the wrapped hand looked between them with the interested expression of someone who could tell he was witnessing something. Lucia tilted her head very slightly toward the back hallway. He stood and followed. She led him to the small consultation room at the end of the corridor. 4 walls, 2 chairs, a desk with nothing on it. The particular stale, neutral air of a room that existed for difficult conversations. She sat. He sat. She folded her hands on the desk and waited. He spoke without preamble. He told her what he'd found, the complete picture, the precise mechanics of how the doubt had been manufactured and by whom. He told her about Marco, about Ricci, about the captains who had carried the story further than it should have traveled. He was methodical and specific, because vague apologies were things people offered when they hoped impression would substitute for accuracy, and she deserved accuracy. He told her that he had failed to trust what he knew directly rather than what was presented to him indirectly, and that this failure had caused her a harm that he did not have a satisfying way to undo, but that he intended to name clearly and honestly rather than dress in softer language. Lucia listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, there was a silence. Then she began to ask him questions. They were hard ones, the kind that required a person to sit with their own behavior and examine it without the comfort of extenuating circumstances. Thus she asked him whether his doubt had been genuine or whether it had been convenient, whether part of him had been looking for a reason to close the distance between them, because closeness frightened him more than conflict. She asked him whether, when he looked back at those 36 hours before he investigated, he'd known in some place below his reasoning that what he'd been told was wrong. He answered honestly. He told her that he had known. He had known in the same way a person knows the temperature of a room the moment they walk into it, before they've assessed it, before they've measured it, in the body before the mind. And he had chosen to investigate rather than trust that knowing immediately, because he had spent 6 years behind walls that he'd built to keep himself in a manageable grief. And Lucia had begun, without asking permission, to walk through those walls simply by being who she was. And that was something he hadn't encountered in a very long time and didn't entirely know how to receive. It was the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in years. He could hear it in his own voice, the strangeness of it, the faint vulnerability of a man who was accustomed to being precise about everything but his own interior. Lucia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to understand that I came to your house furious, and I have spent weeks watching you, and I have formed opinions about you that I did not invite. And what you just told me is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a long time. And I don't quite know what to do with that, but I know that I'm not walking out of here without saying it back." There is a certain quality to moments that are genuinely new. They have a particular texture, a stillness that exists at the center of them, even when everything around them is loud. This moment was one of those. Nothing dramatic happened. They did not reach for each other. They sat in a small consultation room in a clinic on Via Petrarca and acknowledged something true, and the acknowledgement itself was enormous. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Lucia had experienced and unlike anything Enzo had allowed himself in 6 years. He did not pursue her with the extravagance of someone who equated gesture with feeling. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping ceremonies, and no fleet of cars with roses. What there was instead was attention, the deepest, most consistent form of attention, which is the kind that listens and remembers and returns. He brought her books, real ones he'd read and thought she might find interesting, with no notes or inscriptions, just the object itself placed on the table in the hallway where she'd see it when she came off shift. She read them, and he asked about them later, and they talked. Actually talked, in the way that people who are genuinely curious about each other's minds talk, about ideas, about history, about the particular puzzle of how to live a moral life inside an immoral structure, and whether that puzzle was solvable or only ever navigable. She told him about her mother. Not the official version, not the version her father had constructed, but the real one. What Rosa had been like. The specific warmth of her. On the way she'd hummed while she cooked and kept every letter anyone had ever sent her in a box under the bed. Enzo listened with the quality of attention that makes a person feel fully received, fully witnessed, a quality she recognized as rare in anyone and exceptional in a man of his position, where most people listened only to determine what to do next rather than to actually understand. He told her about Giovanna. Slowly, over multiple evenings, or in pieces rather than all at once. the way that grief is best shared, a manageable portion at a time. He told her about the market, about the ceramic saints, about the bedroom window, and the promise made in it. He told her about the 11 days at the bedside. He told her that the 3 daily visits to the grave had begun as a coping mechanism and become a devotion, and that he didn't know how to stop, because stopping felt like a second loss, like admitting that the chapter was truly over, rather than just paused. Lucia did not tell him to stop. She understood, with the precision of someone who had carried her own grief and learned its specific architecture, that grief and love occupy the same chambers of the heart, and that you cannot evict one without damaging the other. She told him instead that she didn't think love worked the way people described it, as a torch that burned one person at a time. She thought it was more like a house, and that a house could hold more than one generation, more than one era, more than one of its rooms being lived in at once. He looked at her when she said that with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the quiet gravity, not the measured composure, but something open and almost young. The expression of a man who has been given something he didn't know he was waiting for. Donna Carmela engineered nothing but observed everything with the satisfied precision of a woman who had been right about people for 81 years and intended to continue. She called Lucia to her sitting room on a Tuesday morning in January, and she pressed a small gold ring into Lucia's palm, a thin band with a single worked detail around the edge, old and warm from being held. She told her it had belonged to Enzo's grandmother, a woman of extraordinary stubbornness and considerable joy. She told her that she had watched this house become a beautiful, grief-filled mausoleum since Giovanna died, and that Lucia had walked into it and opened windows without even realizing she was doing it. She told her that her blessing was not hers to give, that Lucia's choices were her own, but that if the question was whether there was room in this family for another strong woman, the answer was emphatically yes and had been since before anyone asked. Lucia held the ring in her palm for a long time after Donna Carmela had moved on to discussing the appropriate temperature for the heating in the East Wing. Marco came to her in February. He appeared at the clinic on a Wednesday morning when she was between patients, standing in the corridor with the specific discomfort of a young man who has prepared something difficult to say and is not entirely sure how it will be received. He told her that he knew what he'd done and that he understood it had not been small. He told her that he'd been operating from a place he wasn't proud of, something juvenile and selfish disguised as concern, and that he recognized the full shape of it now in a way he hadn't when it was happening. He did not ask for her forgiveness. Not exactly. He told her that he didn't think he'd earned it yet, and that he was more interested in demonstrating over time that it was possible than in requesting it as a shortcut. Lucia regarded him for a long moment. She told him she appreciated that he knew the difference between asking for forgiveness and working toward it. She told him they would call it a beginning and build from there. Marco nodded, and the relief on his face was so genuine it briefly made him look about 15 years old. The resolution of her father's debt was the piece of this that Lucia had turned over the most in her mind, because she had come to this house as a partial consequence of that debt, and she was determined that the resolution of it would be entirely clean and entirely her own doing. She sat with Enzo one evening in the study, the fire going, the books around them, the two of them at opposite ends of the couch that had become over the preceding months, in their habitual evening territory, and she told him what she wanted. She wanted her father's debt to be settled formally, documented, and closed, not through her presence, not through any arrangement between men, but through a negotiated financial settlement to which Teo would contribute from his own resources, reduced by a reasonable amount that acknowledged Enzo's original act as genuine rather than merely transactional. She had worked out the figures. She had them written down. She passed him the paper. Enzo read it. He looked at her. He told her that the figures were fair. He told her that he found her extraordinary. She told him to sign the paper and save the commentary for later. He signed the paper. He was smiling when he did it. Not the near smile, not the adjacent movement, but an actual smile that changed the whole architecture of his face in a way that made her understand exactly why Donna Carmela had been humming to herself in the kitchen for the past 2 weeks. Teo Mancini, when the settlement arrived, sat at his kitchen table and cried in the quiet way of men who have spent so long holding things that release arrives as physical sensation. Lucia sat with him. She did not say much. She did not need to. The proposal happened in the way that real things often happen. Not as a performance, not as a stage, but as an extension of an ordinary moment that had become extraordinary simply by being genuine. They were walking near the edge of the estate grounds one evening in late March, when the air had begun to carry the first suggestion of spring, and the bay was visible from the eastern path as a long, dark mirror under a sky full of stars. Enzo stopped. He turned to her. He told her that he did not want to ask her anything that was connected to obligation or arrangement or anything that had existed between their families before this. He told her he wanted to ask her something that was only and entirely about the two of them, about who she was and who he was becoming, slowly, in her presence. He told her he wanted to ask her if she would choose this. Choose him. Not the house, not the name, and not the resolution of anything, but the man who went to a grave 3 times a day and had stopped going alone. Lucia stood in the spring dark and looked at him. She asked him one question. She asked him if he would ever stop going. He told her no. He told her that some love didn't disappear, it just made room. She said yes. The wedding was held in the estate's courtyard in May, under a sky that cooperative with the occasion in the way Neapolitan skies sometimes are, warm and clear and faintly golden in the late afternoon. There were perhaps 40 people, family, close and trusted. Donna Carmela in the chair that had been placed in exactly the right position with the decisive authority of a woman who was not going to miss a single detail of this. Franco standing beside Enzo with the expression of a man who would never admit to being moved and was utterly moved. Marco, so standing straight, quieter than usual, watching his father with something that might have been the beginning of understanding what it meant to love someone well. Lucia wore white but no veil. She had told the dressmaker very clearly that she intended to see everything. The dressmaker had looked at her and said that made sense, and made her something simple and perfect that required no adjustment, because it fit her exactly as she was. Enzo held both her hands through the entire ceremony. His hands were very still. Hers were also still, but it was a different kind of stillness. Not held, but chosen. There is a difference, and the people who knew them both could see it. When it was done, Donna Carmela lifted her glass and said only, "Finally." And everyone laughed, including Enzo, fully and without reservation, in a way that his son would later tell his own children he had not heard since he was small. The morning after the wedding, Lucia woke early. The light was still gray and thin, the hour just before dawn. She reached across and found the other side of the bed already cool. She dressed, found her shawl on the chair, and walked through the quiet house and out across the grounds. Enzo was at the grave. He was speaking quietly, as he always did in the evenings, the low, private conversation of a man and a memory. She walked across the damp grass and came to stand beside him. He did not startle. He had heard her coming, and he had not moved, because he had been waiting for her. Not this morning specifically, not this exact moment, but the general arrival of someone who would eventually choose to be beside him in the hard places rather than only the easy ones. He reached without looking, and his hand found hers. He finished what he was saying. The grave was still. The bay in the distance was barely visible, a suggestion of silver between the dark hills. The morning birds had begun. Somewhere in the trees behind them, a tentative experimental sound, the way dawn always begins, with something small testing the silence before the world commits to the day. They stood like that for a long time. Then together, hands still joined, they walked home through the gray light toward a house that was no longer a mausoleum, toward a family that was slowly, imperfectly, genuinely putting itself back together. There was nothing resolved about the world they moved through. It was still Naples, still complicated, still full of the particular moral weight of the life Enzo had built and the choices that had made it. But wait, Lucia had come to understand, was not the same as hopelessness. Wait was just the feeling of something real. And what they had was real. 3 times a day. He had gone for 6 years, alone. He would go again tomorrow, and the day after, for as long as he lived. But he would never go alone again. He went to that grave 3 times a day until someone finally understood that he wasn't mourning. He was keeping a promise, and she loved him enough to help him keep it. Did this story move you? If My Father 3 times a day had you feeling every chapter, the fury, the pain, the slow, beautiful unraveling of 2 people who were never supposed to soften each other, then this story was made for you. Now, here's what to do next. Save this story so you can come back to it, because the second read hits completely differently once you know how it ends. Drop a comment. Tell us, were you Team Lucia from Chapter 1, or did Enzo win you over slowly like he won her? Follow for more, because we have more full-length stories exactly like this one waiting for you. Love that earns itself, grief that makes room, and characters who feel like people you've actually met. Share this with someone who needs a story that doesn't take shortcuts, someone who knows that the best love is never the easiest one. The next story drops soon. You don't want to be the last to read it.